From the Chicago Sun-Times newsroom, I'm Natasha Korecki, and this is Off Message, our weekly political talk show. Today we're talking about the entirety of the 3 different gubernatorial debates. This race is neck and neck, but let's go over just some of the more specifics of what we saw in these 3 debates. Do you think that when you look at the 3 debates, there was a clear winner or a clear loser?
I don't think there's a clear winner, clear loser. I do think that Bruce Rauner ended up maybe coming out a little bit ahead just by not seeming like he was just a rich businessman. Like, he actually was better than expected. Like, he wasn't terrible. I don't know that he was particularly great, but he wasn't bad at all. And so I was mildly impressed by his performance there. Governor Quinn, kind of came into his own by the 3rd debate and was a little looser, making some jokes and stuff like that. So he looked less like the professional politician who's been stumping for 30 years.
Clear winner?
No, I think they both stayed very much on message. I don't think there was any moment that really will go down in history as we've seen in some of the presidential or vice presidential debates over the years. I do think that Rauner benefits from looking, I think, more informal, more natural than perhaps we might have expected from someone who makes more money than 99.99999% of the world. And I think he was well trained. I thought Quinn looked a little bit stiff, particularly, I think, in the last debate even. He looked kind of stiff, kind of grim.
I thought Rauner picked up as the debates went along. By the last one, he had perfectly memorized the answers he was going to give, so that no matter what questions there were, he was going to give those answers, and he reinforced his message, which I think is that Pat Quinn is a failure.
He's a failure. Governor Quinn has failed. He's failed on what matters. He's failing on jobs, failing on taxes, failed.
I think the F word was mentioned by Bruce Rauner more times in that 3rd debate than in the movie Goodfellas, which he played off of in one of their door hangers that we got.
Oh, you must be a Republican voter.
I'm a suburban Republican woman.
Because I don't get those mailings in my house.
Well, I saw it a little differently, I guess. I think there was just an overall progression in the debates. The first one, they were both being very safe. The second debate, I thought that Rauner really came off very strong at the end.
Governor Quinn, this is more of the baloney that you throw out continuously.
At the 3rd debate, the question was, can you name one business that you've had that's created jobs in Illinois? And he could not.
I'd encourage you to come to the website for my old firm. There are hundreds and hundreds of companies.
He should have owned that. He should have been prepped for it, right?
It was an important moment in the debate, but is it true to say that Rauner couldn't name a thing? He wouldn't.
There are so many.
He won't talk about his companies. There's no Office Depot that he's going to trot out there that's the perfect example of why he's such a great guy. His company is GTCR and all these other little things that he just doesn't want to seem to be attached to them. There have to have been some successes.
Right. Well,
if he names a company, then they'll say, well, you only name one company. If you name a company, then we're all going to seize on that company and find the flaws.
On so many other companies.
Know,
Why not try to seize on something that's more positive than the one
don't you think at some
we've
point his campaign should have said, here's 3 success stories. They brought jobs to Illinois. Here's the 3 that are safe. I mean, look, they have a huge opposition research team. They could have vetted that, right?
I think so. But it was a business that was about slicing and dicing companies and making money. And so by not talking about anything, then he's, I think, trying to shift the subject away from the way they made their money.
Well, as a side note, during the Q&A afterward, he did come up with one name.
Well, we'll start looking into
Several.
say.
Get on that. Most often used line, you were saying failure, the F word. For Quinn, what was it?
Money.
Money can't buy you facts.
Everything was, this is a guy who's made so much money, he won't even lift the minimum wage for everyday workers. And he just kept saying money, money, money. So this is Mr. Moneybags over here.
That's what billionaires do.
There were a couple different instances where he referred to Rauner as a born-again advocate of term limits.
Born-again term limits advocates.
The last debate, you see Pat Quinn mentioning the minimum wage repeatedly.
The minimum wage, minimum wage, the minimum wage, the minimum wage, or minimum wage, minimum wage, minimum wage.
Democratic Party has chosen this as a strategy across the country to focus on wage gap and the minimum wage in particular. And so even people who aren't affected by it, the thinking goes, are going to be sympathetic to it. And of course, it's a ballot initiative here in Illinois, non-binding. People who have been in government have had opportunities to raise the minimum wage without a non-binding ballot initiative, but using this as a way to try to get people fired up.
I now see people in their emails to me saying, how can you defend this failed governor? Failed. I mean, it's in that repetition has its work.
Rauner saying failed, failure just as many times as Quinn saying minimum wage.
I think it is interesting the way that Bruce Rauner not only mentions failure, but he keeps saying Pat Quinn's name.
Pat Quinn has been a disaster. Pat Quinn has been a disaster. Pat Quinn's failed. Pat Quinn's a phony. Pat Quinn has failed.
Governor Quinn doesn't do that. He says, my opponent.
That's exactly what my opponent did. My opponent would slash. My opponent will not do that. My opponent wanted me to veto that bill.
You know, Bruce Rauner clearly trying to link literally the name of Pat Quinn with, as Dan says, the F word.
What about most unanswered question?
On the part of Rauner is the assault weapon ban.
We need to keep the guns out of hands of criminals.
It was asked repeatedly. I think it's pretty clear he's not for one, but he didn't say it in so many words. And there was another situation like that with Quinn, but I might defer to Mick on that.
Well, I mean, and this question's been asked in various ways, but it's just simply, what are you going to do with the state's budget and fiscal crisis? And neither of them has given really a straight up answer. And so you've seen that sliced and diced in different ways, whether it's asking Governor Quinn about, are you going to raise the income tax again during the special session?
If you do lose, will you commit today to not put through an income tax hike, make that income tax hike permanent in November and December, as you said you wanted to in 2 weeks ago? Will you commit to not doing that?
I believe in investing in education. I'm committed to education.
Bruce Rauner, what do you mean by you're going to create a pro-growth environment and that's suddenly going to solve all of our budget problems?
We need to make Illinois pro-business and pro-growth.
This big empty space when this question is answered.
Didn't you find that bizarre that Quinn wouldn't answer that question? Geez, we all know he's in favor of this tax increase. I mean, why wouldn't he say that? It just looks silly.
Well, he'd rather call it maintaining the
but he
increase.
Didn't even do that.
I think he
Well, he did say
though.
it was. I think on the last bite of the apple there, I think he didn't say yes. I'm going to support continued income tax at the level that it was increased to 3 years ago.
Well, don't you think the reason
there's no other way you can make the numbers work at this stage?
Well, don't you think the reason that they don't answer yes or no is because of all of the commercials? I mean, he's trying to not give Rauner, you know, that 2-second video that says, and what did Quinn say?
Yeah.
Yes, you know, and Rauner likewise is trying not. He knows that the assault weapon issue is going to be used against him. It already has been.
If he gives a direct answer, you're right. That video clip is circulating before the debate's over. Absolutely.
I think the most effective moment in any of the debates was the first one when Amanda Vinicki, one of the journalists questioning them, asked Rauner, help me do the math here. And that gets to, I think, the most important unanswered question for Rauner, which is how does he make the math work?
Make that add up, please.
We've got to set our goals and our priorities and then manage to them.
He says he's not going to continue the income tax increase that Quinn and the legislature instituted, and they had said it would be temporary. He is going to make it temporary, but he also says he's going to increase funding for education. So how do you do that? When they asked him that in the last debate, all he could come up with was by growing the economy and cutting waste. Those are facile answers that we hear again and again and again, and that's a far cry from putting together a detailed budget, which is what a governor has to do.
Well, with that, why don't we close up with quotes of the week?
Mine is from Bruce Rauner's campaign spokesman. He said, Bruce wasn't involved with it. This has been an answer to so many questions that we've asked the campaign about Bruce Rauner's businesses. It's just telling to me, a guy who is essentially campaigning on his record as a successful business person, yet seemingly knows nothing about any of the companies that he actually owned. It's pretty striking.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, my quote comes from the outgoing Chicago City Treasurer Stephanie Neely. She was mentioned in the debates more than once by Bruce Rauner, and she was asked about that, and she said she found it, quote, somewhat comical because I don't know him. You know, I think that he was just trying to get at the fact that she was mentioned as a potential lieutenant governor, and then they chose a white, Greek-American male named Paul Vallis instead of.
You're the only one who would make that distinction.
Well,
all right.
There you go.
My quote is, I've worked for almost 2 decades at the Chicago Sun-Times because it had a soul. This is from the resignation letter of our colleague Dave McKinney, who was always such a big part of this show.
And mine is also from Dave McKinney's resignation letter. We reporters have a healthy suspicion of both parties and candidates. It's our job. It's regrettable that this issue has emerged in the home stretch of an important election in Illinois. But respectfully, this isn't about either candidate or the election. It's about readers and their trust in us, so my decision could not wait. I hate to leave, but I must. Dave McKinney was a frequent contributor to the show, and he will be sorely missed by all of his colleagues, and this has been a rough week for all of us. With that, we will see you next week on Off Message.